Since this is going to be recorded, I want to speak to not just everybody who's here, but also the people who are going to watch this afterwards. So, hi everyone, my name is David Holper, and I am the current Poet Laureate for the city of Eureka. Before I get started today reading some of the poems that I've written over the last 2 years, I want to say thank you to some folks today. So here goes my thank you list. I want to thank Eureka City Council member Leslie Castellano for reaching out to me when she was just getting the first ideas of the Poet Laureate program together, and for all her support during this 2-year period. She's been wonderful. I want to thank all the other members of the City Council as well. Thank you to Christy Patterson with the Ink Lab for her encouragement and support in my application. Thank you to Libby Maynard, the Executive Director of the Ink People, for her patience with all my stupid questions. Thank you, especially big thank you to Monica Topping of the Ink People for her consistent support, help, and encouragement, particularly in getting me through hanging the hybrid show this last semester. I knew nothing about hanging an art show at all, nothing. And Monica helped me figure it all out and get it all up on the walls. So that was amazing. Thank you to Youth Poet Laureate Izzy Unzinger for helping me judge the hybrid show and for being such a great participant over these 2 years. Thank you to my dear friends Vanessa Vertiak and Therese Fitzmaurice of the Humboldt Poetry Show for their unflagging support of everything I was doing over these 2 years and for providing such an awesome performance space for local poets. Thank you also to my dear friend Annie Fricke for her help in co-editing the Behind the Mask chapbook, as well as all your help and encouragement in sharing our writing with one another. Thanks to all the local poets in the local poetry community for their support and involvement with the Poet Laureate program. I see James right there, and there's one of them. And this big thank you, big shout out to Matt Knight, who's with Access Humboldt, who made all this possible, all this technology, because without Matt, there would be no reading today. So thank you, Matt. So in terms of being the Poet Laureate for the last couple of years, I just wanted to give a kind of rundown on some of the things that I've done. I put together this hybrid show. I had 20 poets write short poems about the local area of Humboldt County, and then I gave those pieces of poetry to 20 artists who had already submitted a digital portfolio. So we had selected those 20 artists, and then each of them created a piece of artwork for the poem that was selected. And that show of 20 poets and 20 artists was in September 2020. On the Ink People's website, there's a Poet Laureate page, and I created a subpage there for 20 local poets with their bios and links to information about them so that the local community could get to know some of our poets. Somebody reached out to me to ask me to be a coordinator and MC for the Against the Wind Youth, our festival youth night. And so I did that with, I don't know, roughly 20 youth poets in fall of 2019. I went to the local Mensa group and gave a talk in January 2020 at the Samoa Cookhouse. I met with one of the youth poet laureates, Izzy Unzinger, and talked with her about her work and opportunities for utilizing her writing in her life. I did a reading with those 3 friends I mentioned, Vanessa Vertiak, Therese Fitzmaurice, and Annie Fricke at the Humboldt County Library. We called it September Serenade, and we did it in fall of 2019. I did a reading at the HSU Library in fall of 2019. I helped both the city of Arcata and the city of Eureka coordinate window poems because they wanted to put poetry up in the windows of some of the buildings to help at the start of the pandemic. As I mentioned, this friend of mine, Annie Fricke, and I co-edited a poetry chapbook of 40 local poets writing about the pandemic. It's called Behind the Mask, and if you go to the Ink People's website and find the Poet Laureate page, you can download a copy of that for free. Once the pandemic had started, a lot of people reached out to me and said, what are you going to do for poetry online? I said, I have no idea. And but one thing, after a couple more emails like that, I decided I should start some kind of group. So I started a group called Poetry on the Edge on Facebook, which you're welcome to join. And there are about, I don't know, it's inching up toward 300 people on that with a lot of local poets who are posting all the time. I read a poem called Newer Miracles at the Humboldt County Office of Education Equity Summit in January 2020. And then I took that chapbook that we had created, the Behind the Mask chapbook, and I submitted it to the Humboldt State University Pandemic Archive Project, so there would be some kind of record of what was being written during this period of time. And the last thing that sort of got launched, but is probably going to be delayed till next year, is that I joined with the Eureka chapter of the NAACP to help them organize the David Josiah Lawson Oration Festival. And because not too many submissions came in this year, I think it'll happen next year, but it'll be face-to-face instead of online. So that's a little of what I've been doing over the last 2 years besides teaching full-time. So anyway, now to the more important stuff, to the poetry that was written during this period of time. So I'm going to read you a range of poems, all sorts of different kinds of things, some more experimental, some more traditional. And this collection is tentatively called Board for N. And this is something I read about online. People magazine did an article on this. It's a Swedish restaurant. Board for N means table for one. And this restaurant recently opened when the pandemic began. It's a single table in a field, and the food is sent via a cable in a basket, and only one person per day in this restaurant is served. And I thought that's the perfect title for this collection, Board for N. Please sit. This is your table. The leg it stands on roots in earth, like the Galapagos, where for centuries the flightless cormorant harbored without fear of predation. We offer one special today, safety. It comes with a cyan of sky over a russet bed of this fallow field where we promise you will be left utterly alone. We will send your meal via cable in a wicker basket. We placed a little checkered cloth over the food like the print from Dorothy's dress in which the tornado swept her far from any world she knew. What else is available? Sorry, we're out of assurances. Yet even in the whirlpool, it is still the safest restaurant in the world. If when your food arrives, a sparrow alights, we would appreciate it if you offer her a little bread, a sip of water from your glass. She has come so far to be with you, and it takes so little to show you have not forgotten your humanity at home. Okay, so this next one, I think, deals with the whole feeling of uncertainty that all of us felt when the pandemic began. And in fact, that's what it's called, uncertainty. That spring when the disease arrived, like storm clouds, we all sat in the darkness of our homes, baking or eating or peering out over the internet, wondering when the light would return. We fumbled our messages, stay safe or be well. The #1 song in America was Say So. No one could say anything certain about the future. In that darkness, no one could tell what would happen when the country reopened, like some intricate Chinese puzzle. Who, after all, knew whether schools would be face-to-face in the fall, or if students all over America would once again stare like zombies into their computer screens, wondering if this was the best that the future had to offer. No one knew if there would ever be a vaccine, no matter the hundreds of efforts underway, or if 6 feet would always be the distance. Even with our loved ones, if someone fell sick in the darkness, the best we could do is wall them off from us, praying the virus would stay put. The mathematical modeling was vague, the testing insufficient, the leadership a bad joke. The only sure thing anyone was counting on was hope, that beautiful feathered thing that seemed to have flown the coop as we sat in our homes, making avatars of ourselves for no purpose whatsoever. Okay, so this next one is an Absidarian. It's called Absidarian on the Cusp of Despair. And if you're unfamiliar with this form of poetry, an Absidarian just uses the letters of the alphabet, so each letter starts the next line. So, Here it is, Absidarian on the Cusp of Despair. And I wrote this just before the election. About hope, I've almost had enough. Every time this nation has about pushed the burning dumpster of itself over the cliff edge, some fool says it's poetry alone that is going to save us. I doubt it. Seriously. We might raise the torch of our fiery voices, igniting every chanting mob to give witness to this nightmare. We might tilt our faces to the crazy blue light of the polemic. But do you honestly think some housewife in Peoria gives a damn about poetry, votes based on your passionate villanelle, finds hope in your airy stanzas and meaningful metaphors? How about we let poetry be what it is? This telling slant of lyricism that sets watchfires burning, that do not just flare up and fade like joss paper. Let's keep poetry for more important matters. Let's decide that language matters more than votes, that nothing that is really going to change what we are as a nation, no fleeting opinion poll of verse, is going to turn the tiller hard enough to matter. If people want verse to transform our lives, we're going to need language that questions where we have foundered, resists the easy tendency to pick up the compass and say, we are so lost. No, poetry is just the tip of some unseen great blue iceberg that undergirds what we have so gotten in the habit of ignoring. You see, the real value of poetry is that it wakes us up to what we've grown willfully blind to, even if it's the X right in front of our noses, yelling at us in our somnambulistic death march. You want Zion? You're going to have to let language awaken you to everything. Okay, so one of the things about the early days of the pandemic is that we learned a lot about viruses. And one of the things that I came across when I was reading about COVID early on was that it was a zoonotic spillover, which I'd never heard that term before. So I looked it up. So a zoonotic spillover, according to Plowright et al., is defined as the transmission of a pathogen from a vertebrate animal to a human. And there are theories about this, although no one's exactly proved it, that it maybe came from bats or it came from pangolins, but no one really knows for certain. So when I was thinking about writing this poem, I was thinking about a house from the movie The Summer of 42, which sits out on a promontory in Mendocino someplace. And that's the house that I imagined. So here it is, Zoonotic Spillover. The body is a house. It stands alone, weathered on a promontory. Although it's spring and the winds are blowing in off the sea, the doors and the windows are all open, the lace curtains waving. If someone were to wander down to the house, nothing would stop them from barging in. They could invite their friends. They could bring bats. They might have a party. And by the time you discover the wreckage they have left, it might leave you gasping for breath, feverish with rage. Go inside now. Fasten the windows, lock the doors, take a breath. Tell yourself it is going to be okay, even if you understand it isn't. All right, so another of the aspects of the pandemic that I think people might not have imagined when it began was that a lot of instances of domestic violence surged all over the world. It wasn't unique to our country. And during the course of this, one day I heard some noise outside and went outside to look. And this is the incident that I'm describing. So this poem is called Choices. There's a woman in the street screaming. Her voice rises as if she expected a blue ribbon for the catalog of failures she pins on the man who shadows her. For a moment, she lets silence claim her in the summer dark, as if she were locating the next track, and begins again, her voice miraculously leaping at least an octave, as if what came before were mere warm-ups. I wish I could say to myself, this is the first time I have stood witness to such a fight. How I wish that I were unfamiliar with this banal script. The way she will up the ante till at some point he will grab her or tell her to shut up, or both. And the way after she falls, she will bear that shadowy mark on her flesh among other women, much like herself, who made the mistake of thinking love covers a multitude of their men's sins. Her voice yanks me back hard. It shatters like a plate glass implosion just as they pass my house. I go out, stand on the porch. While she looks away, he turns, glares as if I had no right to interrupt. Something so intimate, some act only he grasps. And then they ink themselves into the summer shadows. But still, even at this distance, I can hear her splintered cry for love that needs no words, and his answering bellow that reminds her this is not how things work in the world, where no matter what she shrieks at him, his fists get to make all the choices. Okay, so I'm sure that many of you, while you were reading things on the internet at the start of the pandemic, read about some of the people who were stranded by the pandemic. I remember reading about a travel vlogger for YouTube by the name of Eva Zubek from Poland, who was stranded on an island in the Indian Ocean called Socotra. And then I read about this Bolivian pan flute orchestra that had gone to Berlin for a music festival, which didn't happen. And then they couldn't fly back home to Bolivia. So the government housed them in the Rheinsberg Palace on the outskirts of Berlin. It's a huge property. It's like 600 acres. And so it started getting me to think about my mother's family, who they were originally from Berlin. And I was starting to think about some of those connections. And so this poem came out of it. So it's called Berlin. And by the way, if you don't know this, Berlin is sometimes called the city of bears. My mother's family fled Berlin in 1937, just before the borders slammed shut, trapping the Jews and anyone else the Nazis found disposable. I visited the city several times while the wall still stood. Every time I found myself in the city of bears, I thought of my grandmother's stories of the delights of the theater, the white asparagus wrapped in ham, their wonderful apartment, all gone. This late spring, news arrives of a Bolivian pan flute orchestra trapped at Rheinsberg Palace, unable to fly home. Unable to do anything but practice 6 hours a day. They are permitted to wander the forest line on the 600-acre property. Wolves wander beyond. Every time I think of them there, I think of my grandfather Daniel and his brother driving back to Berlin from a porcelain factory they owned. Stuck behind a slow-moving truck, they couldn't endure the weight, so they veered off on a frontage road behind a row of trees, racing to pass the truck. They ran head-on into an oncoming truck and both were killed instantly. What does this have to do with borders or orchestras or the pandemic? Nothing, I imagine. It is only where my mind travels in the long hours of solitude, out along the forest line where the wolves dwell, in the midst of memory and dreams, wondering what the future will hold for us all. Okay, so this poem was much more recent. I just wrote this about a month ago, and it's called Masterclass in Disaster. And it's about some of the connections that I see between 9/11 and the disasters of that day, and then the more recent disasters associated with the pandemic. There is a line in the poem that I just want to alert you to. It says, go to the boulder in the field. And what that's referencing is a colleague of mine at College of the Redwoods, Dickie LaPenta, was engaged to a man named Richard Guadagno. And on 9/11, he was on that flight that crashed outside of Philadelphia in a field. And there's a memorial in that field with a giant boulder there to the victims of that crash. And Richard Guadagno is celebrated posthumously with a National Wildlife Refuge just across the freeway from CR. So here it is, Masterclass in Disaster. Pour water on the hot spots. Let the ashes settle. Let the wounds heal if they will heal. Understand what refuses to be understood. Go to the boulder in that field and ask again, why him? Stare into the windows and think of ice, salt, topaz, of her ruckled face there under the morphine as she was dying, the lines plowed deep into her flesh, the nurses frowning in their hazmat suits, the monitor flatlining. Gather with a few friends at that Italian restaurant in Daytona Beach. Star says, where were you that day? So imagine us all spilling the beans, our mundane survivors' tales. Only after we finish, Star tells us about her nephew, his first day working at Amex in New York City. He had those first day ticker tape skitters. When others around him stood to go to the window staring, he stayed glued to his computer, typing diligently away. Only after the cop came into the room and shouted to evacuate did he look up. He raced along with the crowd to the elevator, jammed in with all the sheep, terrified, dialing cell phones, trying desperately to reach someone and going to voicemail. He couldn't think of who he should call. When he got to the front door, the fireman bellowed at him, whatever you do, for God's sake, don't look back. Like Lot's wife, he couldn't stop himself. He remembered it in slow-mo, the body tumbling, the man's tie flapping upward. He turned away before the body stopped on the concrete. After that, none of us could find a word to say. Ice, salt, topaz, numbers mean nothing. It is the vacuum after the body is lowered, after the ashes are cast upon the waters. Don't bother trying to explain. Until you have stood in that absence and felt love shattered beyond repair, there are no words to explain. Okay, so this next poem sort of involves a situation before the pandemic, but I thought this poem sort of fit with the pandemic, so I threw it in. It's kind of a riff off of Gary Snyder's poem, I Went Into the Maverick Bar. So there's a place in Eureka called the Double A Saloon. So this is called I Went Into the Double A Saloon. I went into the Double A Saloon to get us a pair of steaks with cold beers to wash them down. So much has changed in this town since I first arrived, a firefighter, dusting the ash from my hair, afraid to go back to college, but not sure what else I was good for. Most of the fishing is gone, the old growth cut and milled or protected. Even the Vietnam vets who came here after the war to grow dope in the hills find that era has passed with legalization. Now, a good mechanic shop morphs into a gardening center. A favorite coffee shop falls prey to a smoking room. We play shuffleboard with a Friday night crowd of truckers and cops and warehouse workers, not a tourist in sight, though the town is full of them. This America somehow manages in this small space to make its peace. I do not declare myself as anything here, surely not a poet. When we've eaten our fill, had enough of this small celebration, we wander out under the pale stars. If this is to be the end of our empire, I cannot say that the world will be worse off without our guns, our armies, our imperialism. Whatever dream we dreamed is crashing now, and I salute the best of it, letting all the bloodshed and waste go. Now it's time for something new, and I offer that coming beast my blessing in this darkening hour. So another aspect of being Poet Laureate is I wanted to celebrate some of the things about Eureka that I really liked. And so some of those were natural places and some of those were events. So this is celebrating the North Jetty at the mouth of the bay, a spot that I love to go visit. And so I went out there one day early on, as after I'd been appointed poet laureate, to write about it. And this crazy poem arose out of it. North Jetty. I have come to this edge for nothing. To write a poem is such a useless effort. Even if the poem amounts to something, what good will it do? Will my sitting and scribbling this morning at the mouth of Humboldt Bay, watching the indigo swells roll in off the Pacific, change anything? Will it, for instance, feed a starving child, or teach someone to read, or cause someone to abandon a prejudice poisonous enough to make them pick up a gun and slaughter everyone in sight? Surely not. I kick my feet against the concrete block where I sit, remembering how my younger daughter one spring asked me to lift her into our cherry tree, both of us burying our faces in the white blossoms and laughing uproariously. Until that moment, the blossoms had been merely blossoms. It is the same with poetry, I imagine. All a poem ever seems to do is deliver you to this moment, as a cormorant lifts off, wingtips beating blue water, until it leaps into the air, disappearing westward. As for me, I vanish from the empty beach, pocketing a sand dollar as I go. When I set its circular form on my porch rail and later fall into sleep, perhaps you might notice how the full moon rises out of this form, offers its pale witness to everyone. Perhaps that is the most that can be expected from any poem, or maybe such beauty defies utility, transforming us all in moonlight. Okay, so this next poem involves a little something about my family, and that is that once the pandemic began, all three of our children, we're all adults now, came back to live at home. Two of them to go to school and one of them to live at home and work. And so that lasted for most of the year. And then our oldest daughter moved out and moved back down to the Bay Area. So this is sort of about that moment or just before it. And it involves Headwaters Forest, which is a forest reserve about 20 minutes from my house. 3 Mile Bridge, late summer, Headwaters. At the railing, listen to all that is offered. The song of the creek below, a glass of water poured endlessly over cobble, the lonely song of a hermit thrush somewhere unseen, a reminder of so much that sits just below the edge of perception. High above, a gentle wind stirs the canopy like a sigh. Summer is almost over. My daughter will be leaving for the city soon. A leaf drops in slow motion from above, landing in the water, spinning, and slowly borne away. Okay, so I mentioned just what, as some of the people started to arrive, that I'm going to retire soon at the end of the semester. And my plan for the following summer is to go to Spain once that opens up and go hike the Camino Santiago, which is a trail. People have been doing it for, almost, 1,500 years now, I think. And so this trail runs from the border of France and Spain through the Pyrenees and then due west to Santiago, where St. James is apparently buried, according to church history. And then people go beyond that even to the ocean. So it's about 500 miles, and I'm really looking forward to hiking it. And along the route, there's this big hill, and on top of it, there's an iron cross. That's the Cruz de Ferro. And I've been there. I've seen the Cruz de Ferro, and people bring stones to the cross, and they leave them there as a sort of memory. And the poem kind of addresses why people do that. I have pulled down the blinds on this sunny afternoon to match my exhaustion. I have worked since I was 15, which means I've spent 48 years giving over the days of my life to feed myself, feed my family. I have little time left. With the sands running down, I do not want to squander even a minute more in unhappiness. I do not want to resent anyone or listen to anyone resent me. In Spain, high atop a lonely hill, there is an iron cross where pilgrims come and lay a stone or some token at the base. It has grown into a great mound of stones that pilgrims have borne from across Spain, across continents, bearing them from every corner of the world. They consign them there in remembrance of the dead or to honor someone's suffering. Some lay down a burden. As for me, I would bring a bag of stones so heavy it has nearly broken me. I will lay them down and say a prayer for all that remains. Here in the shadows of the afternoon, and I say thank you for each moment. Until that day, I will bear my labors as best I can without complaint. Let the shadows fall far over the afternoon until the evening can answer. I am finally learning great patience from these many decades. I am learning to bear this terrible miracle of stones. Okay, so usually when I teach poetry, I teach a lot of form because I find that it's really good for beginning poets to learn how to write a sonnet or a villanelle or a sestina or something like that. But in this particular collection of poetry, there's almost no form poetry. And then one day I was writing and this little strange poem emerged called Working Within a Form, which isn't really a form, but at least it rhymes. And there's a kind of meter in it. There is a tension in the form that forms a tension in the line that speaks to how you choose a word or cut one free to simplify. There is a tension in a life that lives within this sense of form, and having it, you work within what bounds your days between sun and shade, making you choose most carefully what will and will not suffice. And thus you do. You choose a form and fashion well, so when you're done, the seams won't tell. Okay, among my other strange habits, one of them that I developed when my kids were really little is that every time we would go on a hike or go to the beach or go to the forest, I would always pick up a stone and I would bring it home, and I have this wicker basket in my bedroom by the sink, and I would put the stone into this basket as a way to remember time spent with my kids, as a family with my wife too. So one time when my wife and I were at the beach, we found this pair of stones where the lower stone was kind of like the bed and the upper stone was like an egg, and it had worn a perfect kind of egg-shaped groove into the lower stone so that they were sort of bedded as a matching pair. So this is called pairing. These two dolomite stones bedded together for such a time until the lower one, through wind, weather, and water, made a bowl of itself for the smaller in which to sit. They rest together as if asleep. Together, they are no larger than an egg, stolid, solitary, gritty. They did not ignore the rise or fall of tides or even the poking of an inquisitive crab in that vanished time. Now they sit in a basket by my sink. I wonder at them sometimes in their great patience and think how long after I'm worn down to nothing, they will sit a little longer and be utterly still in their stony quietude. Okay, so these next two poems were both, I don't know, sort of playfully written in terms of form, but they both address my relationship with my father. He's long dead now, but we had a difficult relationship. And so the poems both speak to that. The first one is called Subjunctive Mood. And if you're not an English person, the subjunctive mood in English is a way for us to address wishes or hypotheses or things that are made up. So whenever we speak, say, I wish I were a rich man, that's in the subjunctive mood because it deals with hypotheticals. So this poem is called Subjunctive Mood. If a vase is placed, if on the shoulder of a mountain, a cabin, if on a dusty shelf is where your aged fingers knows. If the whiteout of fog rises through the redwoods, oaks, and bays like water, if the vase is rough to the touch but cerulean to the eye, if the body then is like this, a container holding the scent of certain, if what cannot be said must be said in ways that words do not nor cannot, if ashes are all the bell-shaped vase still holds, if this vase resting in your hands is where tears must not, if what you could not say to your father that last dark moment was, if cannot is all that you can manage now, if finally, if you place back, if the fog still practices its forgetting, if nothing transforms but you in setting. All right, so the next one of the good things about my dad is that he loved to cook, and he gifted me with that love of cooking as well. And so last summer, I bought some eggplants at a farmer's market, and I brought them home. And usually in our family, we refer to them as aubergines. We don't use eggplant, that word, so much. And I love that word, aubergine. And I wanted to find out a little bit more about them. So I looked up a bunch of facts about aubergines. And this poem strangely came out of that exploration. So here it is, aubergine. You can tell their ripeness by the deep, lush purple of the skin, the tight, taut feel they have, so you can depress a finger into its flesh, and they will respond by rebounding into your fingerprint. They are clan of the nightshade family, their darker cousins standing just off stage snickering. My father used to cook them up into baklajana ikra, poor man's caviar, and we feasted knowing no better of the real thing. How light they are in hand after they turn, much like the dead after their spirits have fled. My father's body, only ash in the urn I held in my hand. The boat paused just near Sausalito, and I gazed out over the waters. How I had hated him, how I had loved him in spite of his anger, his scalding wit, how he loved to laugh at people to show them how little he thought of their pretenses. If he drank, be prepared, we'd say. If he smoked, it seemed he'd set the house on fire. The urn in my hand felt round and black as some bitter aubergine. Are there any words to forgive such things? I leaned out and poured these bits of bone and ash upon the waters, speechless, yes, but trying my damnedest to empty him out of me forever. Okay, so, I don't know if this is with everybody who teaches, but for me, I picked up a lot of quotes from famous writers over the years. And one of them, I believe, is W.H. Auden, who was asked at one point in an interview, who's your favorite poet? And I loved his response. He said, poetry is not a horse race, by which I think he meant it's not, like one leader out in front and then a bunch of other people behind. It's like there's lots of great poets. So one day I was thinking about that quote, and this poem came out of it. Poetry is not a horse race. It is not Shakespeare 25 lengths ahead, trailed by Donne, Yeats, Stevens, Frost, and Whitman, and the rest of the pack of dead white men whose hoofbeats thunder in perfect iambic pentameter. Nor is it some other pack of women or oppressed minorities or whatever have you somewhere behind, coming up fast around the backside, moving like some amazing machine to catch the leaders just before the photo finish. No. The poet climbs astride her mount, clicks her tongue, or whispers some magic in the horse's ear, and off they go. There's no track nor other mounts. She rides high into the mountains, having no sense of where the journey will lead. Much later, when she arrives, the horse will be blown and the poet will awaken into the clear blue air, dismount, staring off into the great unknown distances. Don't bother asking her about the poem. Don't bother asking her about anything. She has work to do. It has nothing to do with horses or races or you. Okay, so I mentioned to the lady who's in New York today that we had a big storm here in January and it blew like crazy. And in our backyard, we have about a 50 or 60 foot redwood tree, a solo redwood tree. And redwoods do better in groups because they interlock their roots to stay steady in heavy winds. So I was out there looking at it, wondering, I wonder if it'll fall down or not. And luckily it didn't. But in watching it and watching this intense wind, I started thinking about Aeolus, the god of the wind from ancient Greeks. And I had recently read a poem by Karen Volkman called May. And I love the style and the things, the playful things she was doing with language. So I used that style to imagine what would Aeolus say to us in January about the storm that he created. So here it is. In winter's ragged rain frock and frozen moments, the wind smashes its sledgehammer suitcases into a line of bays behind the house. Blusters, you could be icier blue while bending the great trunks. Bellows, I will strip you to your underthings of bone as I please it. I'll snap humerus or fibula as butter easy as a twigling. You think you can go jack-in-the-box backwardly into your hidey hole? Who do you think throne sits on this icy sun-stripped ball just now? Mere mouseling, I'll make emptiful those spider threads woven between your boxes, leaving you shut in silencing more darkening days than you can uncount. January will have its ever say, while I blow out the sky, blow out the sun, and don't go praying for summer back in your gleeful voices. All that is ever long away, as I unhope sarcasmically in icicles of wind. Okay, and this other poem, A Different Clock, is written in the same style of kind of language play. And it has a little epigram by Jackie Kay, Grief Keeps a Different Clock. And part of that is because in reading so many stories about people who lost loved ones in the pandemic, I was thinking about grief and the way that people encounter it. So anyway, here it is. Time lag stops the tick waiting minutes, dragging their broke beaten heels. Every when, in every dust heavy corner, one cannot unnotice how a day balloonfuls its enormous emptying, like a chipful cup with a holiness in it, then leadful, dreadful, in their mud-slogged shoes, each longing minute wake wonders at its frozen self in the mirror silver, saying, knows that broke heart soul there in the dust blanket corner weeps within not, weeps to world wake the dead, who, as know full well you must, unwakeful sit in their own heaven corner, listening, but telephone unringing, call no when to us living, misering out our end not days. Okay, so now there's a little shift in the poems, and many of these last ones are more political, so just be aware that's what's coming. And this one, I think, doesn't need any explanation. It's just called Daily Bread. In the reinvented country, each time a leader tongued a lie, it was baked into a loaf of bread. We, who knew no better, unwrapped these loaves carefully, peeling back the newspaper cover, setting aside the brittle pages to read later. Each of us cut a slice. It smelled somehow different than the bread we were used to, richer, fresher, more promising. We hungered for such promise, devoured the first dark slice. Oddly enough, as we choked it down, it only left us hungrier than before. We weren't quite sure if we should trust our feelings or not. We picked up the knife, cut a bigger slice, and ate to fill that burning emptiness. Before long, The bakeries replaced the regular bread with this new loaf until there was no more meat or fruit or anything. Perhaps that is when the real sickness began. No one seemed to notice, but we lost our faith in the news. We lost our faith in ourselves, all the while we consumed each slice as if it would alleviate our hunger to know something absolute, something that would sit sure in our gut. But only now have we come to recognize there never was such a thing as the truth. Even that hunger we see now was the biggest lie of all. Okay, and this one I just wrote, I don't know, in the last few weeks in watching the trial via the news. So, and the poem came out of a friend of mine who is a singer, a professional singer, and a singing teacher, writing about the phrenic nerve, which is the nerve that runs alongside of your neck, and its relation to the diaphragm. And so anyway, here it is, phrenic nerve. Take a deep breath if you want to trace the phrenic nerve. It's the one you know that runs from the C3 to the C5 spinal nerves in the neck to the diaphragm, that muscle leveraging open your lungs, sending life rushing into your blood. That nerve is the living wire that holds you to the earth. It is the one on which Officer Derek Chauvin jammed his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, shutting down George Floyd's diaphragm, while 3 other officers stood by and did exactly nothing. A chauvinist, you may recall, is someone with a prejudiced loyalty, in this case, a distilled hatred against a black man's breath. It takes some nerve, after all, to hate a person to death. All over America, that knee struck a nerve, left so many struggling to breathe. But the thing about a nerve is this: after you touch it, the memory of those feelings doesn't just dissipate. You can't take a knee off every black person in America without recognizing George Floyd was only one more black person holding his breath for centuries, waiting for white people to understand how, if you're black, don't even try taking a breath, a knee, or standing up for what's right, without some white person jamming a knee in your neck while any hope of justice is smothered. All right, and on a slightly more hopeful note, I've always loved 4th of July. It's one of my favorite holidays, and I think it was because of the food and the fireworks and the parades, and I don't know, the chance to blow things up as a kid, that just really appealed to me. So I was thinking about 4th of July the last time it rolled around, and there was a lot of protests going on in the country at the time, and so this poem came out of this. If we are to celebrate today, then let it not be what it has been for far too long. Let it not be rage or injustice, anger or death. Let it be a welcoming of everyone, the black, the brown, the Asian, the white. Let the table be set with more than enough places, more than enough space to welcome even more, no matter whom they love, no matter their dress or tattoos, their piercings, their faith or lack thereof. Let the grandmothers and the mothers come with platters heaped with maize and watermelon, salmon and chicken, vegetables, beans, and tofu. Let us devour our history, knowing full well who has suffered and whose hands tied the nooses or lit the torches or beat our brothers and sisters to death. Let us know where we have been and why we must go there no more. Let the slaveholders' statues be toppled. Let new monuments be lifted that celebrate kindness, generosity, courage, and perseverance. Let us lift our voices in song, a great harmony of tears, for all that must fall away, so that we may finally sit in peace and let the song surround us and lift us up, so that we may gather the children and teach them what it means to be a shining light, to which others cannot help but be drawn. So it's like it goes back and forth in this collection. Sometimes hope emerges and then it just gets crushed and then it comes back. So this is a poem that was written in response to the breach of the Capitol building. And it's called On the Night the Capitol Building is Overrun. On the night the Capitol building is overrun, I sit with my adult children and struggle with what to say. I want to somehow reassure them, or perhaps remind them, that America has been in a similar nest of thorns before. I want to say to them, don't think that such hatreds haven't been cooked up before against Black or brown, immigrant or ethnicity, or that such feverish hatred hasn't done worse. We watch on screens the barricades pushed over, walked through. We watch the Confederate flag paraded, and I want to say, another loser supporting a loser for a lost cause. But I hold my tongue. They clamor like a murder of crows. They say, did you see the picture with the thug with his feet on the speaker's desk? Did you see the one who walked off with the dais? Did you see? I find myself heartsick in looking or not looking, listening, but finding myself speechless at the desecration. I am numb that we have walked ourselves to this edge, and there is so little holding us back from going over. There is so little that I can do to protect them if we stumble into this abyss. No one can talk to one another anymore. I am left thinking of these silences and the shouting as I crawl into bed and mourn the America I have known. I realize there are no words to say when the fall begins. All one has left at that point is the screaming. Okay, so just a couple more poems and I'm going to finish up. This poem is called Tulawat Island. So those of you who live in Eureka know about this, but for those of you who don't, on Monday, October 21st of 2019, the city of Eureka, California, officially returned Tulawat Island to the Wiyot tribe because it had been stolen from them. And according to recent research, Eureka is the first city in the United States to return land to any tribe as a gift. I shared this poem with Ted Hernandez, who's the tribal chair of the Wiyot, and we got to talking about it. And I asked him, could somebody write for me a little, bit right at the top to introduce the poem? So he found a woman who wrote this line, and in English, because I can't speak Wiyot or read Wiyot either, it goes like this: our ancestors' spirits can rest because Tulawat has healed and been returned to us. And the poem is written in 3 parts. So part 1. Let us risk ourselves in remembering the forgotten. Step into the darkness of February 26, 1860. What words will ferry you through dark waters to Tulawat Island to conjure the terrors executed on the Wiyot women, children, old men? Even if you dare, what spell might distill your belief in these white men's dark sorcery of machetes, hatchets, and clubs? Imagine it, 6 white men metamorphosing into monsters and casting their incantations of blood, where the Wiyot had merely wished to celebrate the holy renewal of the world. It was not magic that a few escaped. One hid in a trash pile. A child was found suckling at his dead mother's breast. One man leapt into the bay and swam into history. No one knows the number. Only those few survivors could say for certain what the land bore in blood. This is the risk then, to understand what every survivor felt when they heard that great silence spread over which the land keened. Do not forget this place. Do not forget that if ever the world is to be renewed, this is the ground where the people must gather and sing. Part 2. Let us risk stepping beyond that day and imagine who might speak for these dead, their bodies long ago buried in a nearly forgotten history. Imagine if Tulawat could speak. Tulawat might lift its ancient voice out of the gloom of the fog to the misery of the reservation, sing to those imprisoned in Fort Humboldt, to those banished. Tulawat knows the sweet words to tongue to the children ripped from their parents, held hostage in boarding schools, where their native tongues were straitjacketed, where their heads were bent to pray to an unfamiliar God, who miracle ordained everything the white people commanded, until the aftermath meant drinking pain, eating pain, or blinding it in whatever poison served. That too is the risk. To venture into those dark waters where Tulawat cries out, remember what must never be forgotten. Part 3. Let us risk ourselves in recognizing this place where death picks up its skirts and dances with the living. Let Tulawat be returned to the Weha. The land desecrated with trash and toxins, no matter. Do you think anyone can kill the land? Do you think what has been lost cannot be reborn? Did you not recognize the risk in tuning an ear to the joyful voices of those who know what Tulawat has long taught? Blood is unanswered in blood. It is answered in apology, in song, in the whirlwind of the rising dance. For in this celebration, we all prepare to bury old hatreds, to renew the world again. Let Tulawat cry out to bless each of us in renewal, to bless what has been broken, to renew in the gift, in the return. Let us take this final risk in bowing to what must die, in a rebirth to what remains greater in each of us. So bow, make offerings, and let us all rejoice as the land cries out on this good, great day. Okay, one last one. This is called Dirge to Robin's Song. So for a year, I've been sitting at this desk, staring out this window, teaching, and there's a little tree out there right around our chicken coop, and it has these red berries in spring, and the robins just come flocking to it in huge numbers, and oftentimes they're singing and they make a big racket and a big mess, but it's kind of wonderful to watch the whole thing. So this is called Dirge to Robin's Song. And I think this is the right one to end on because it's a little bit more hopeful. This morning, there is a robin singing just outside the window in the sun-drenched garden. She knows nothing of the headlines, the bad news, so many swimming pools of black ink, the 20 years of war we have fought in Afghanistan, the thousands of dead, both friend and foe, whose families no longer have much to sing about. She knows nothing about the pandemic, nor the 2.62 million souls who have perished, often alone, their loved ones, if lucky, staring through a piece of glass or a camera, unable to say goodbye. Yet she sings. She sings with a boldness that I can do nothing but admire. Her trills are magical. They lift the heaviness of my soul, which this long, dark winter has nearly forgotten how to sing, has nearly choked on this bitter bolus of inked and endured griefs. The warming sunlight lifts steam off the fences, off the leaves of the pepperwood tree, which shine pearlescent through the mist. The robin's song warms my tears, which fall almost unnoticed, except for you, who may, if you choose, catch these droplets in the sweetness of the robin's enraptured singing. Do with them what you will.